this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Berlin is a city steeped in history, with its streets, buildings and scars bearing witness to the dramatic events of the 20th century. From the rise and fall of the Third Reich to the Cold War divisions that shaped the modern city, Berlin remains a living museum of its past. Yet beyond the well-known landmarks, countless hidden stories lie waiting to be uncovered. I'm Angus Wallace, and this is the World War II podcast. Joining me today is Peter Graham, a historian and guide who runs walking tours of Berlin, offering visitors an in-depth look at the city's wartime history. He also manages the popular Facebook page Berlin Battle Damage, which explores the lasting marks of war still visible today. We'll be discussing his work, the fascinating remnants of history that can be found across Berlin, and how walking the city's streets brings the past to life. Peter, so thanks for joining me. So we're going to be looking at Berlin, which was in ruins after the war from bombing and the battle for Berlin. But to start, I wonder, what are the most prominent Second World War landmarks that are still standing and have survived the destruction that we can see today?
There's quite a lot still standing, actually. A lot of the central government district, very heavily hit, obviously, by the Allied bombing campaign and then subsequently in the Battle of Berlin. But there's a lot of buildings that survived in various states of disrepair. The obvious one being, it's not a Nazi-era building, but the Reichstag would be the big one. Although it was built in 1894 and was burnt out in 1933, so it was never used by the Nazi government, but it was the focus of the Soviet assault. You know, as you know yourself, the Soviets, it was take the Reichstag. And then, of course, you've got the famous photograph, you know, one of the most famous photographs of World War II with a Soviet soldier hoisting the red flag over the Reichstag, which symbolized the destruction of Nazi Germany. So, yeah, the Reichstag it's a big tourist attraction. Although not a Nazi-era building, it symbolizes the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany. Tempelhof Airport in southwest Berlin is another one. It is a Nazi-era building. It was built in sort of between 36 and 41, although it was never completed by the end of the war. It was never used as an airport, although it was used to assemble Stuka dive bombers and Focke-Wulf 190s. The assembly line was inside the airport. So, yeah, it survived fairly intact. Obviously, it was taken by the Soviets, and then when the city was split up into occupation zones, it fell into the American occupation zone and played a pivotal role in the Berlin airlift.
Have most of the Nazi-era buildings survived as well? They haven't been bulldozed and rebuilt to something more modern? And
No, they've survived intact and not rebuilt or remodeled or anything like that, you know. And Tempelhof is huge. At the time, I believe it was the largest building in the world. It's vast. It's all infrastructure of buildings. It's not just one building, but the main terminal building, if you look at it from above, from the sky, it's actually built in the shape of an eagle. It was designed to be this huge, intimidating, you know, sign of Nazi dominance or whatever, you know. So yeah, it's survived and is used today by various government bodies. It's still in use, not as an airport, obviously, but it stopped being used as an airport, I think, 1991, you know, because the runways weren't long enough for the huge jets that we have today. And another one, you've got the Olympic Stadium, built for the 1936 Berlin Olympics. It has survived completely intact. It has been slightly remodeled. It's used as a football stadium now by, I think, Hertha, the football team Hertha. That's their stadium. It has had sort of tiers of seats put up above the original one, so it's higher than it was at the time. But the original structure is still there. It's just been built on. It played a role in the Battle of Berlin. The Soviets, there was beside it, there was Wehrmacht training grounds. There was a barracks there called Alexander Caserna, and it was used to train Hitler Youth units. One of the only times that the Germans sort of repelled the Soviets was across the Olympic Stadium grounds and to the Wehrmacht training grounds. And the Hitler Youth units pushed the Soviets back to the Olympic Stadium. So yeah, that's another one that's still there, still used. You can go and have a tour around there. The 1936 Olympic bell is still there, complete with swastika. And a hole right through it from an anti-aircraft gun. The Germans had anti-aircraft guns on the stadium field, and Hitler Youth gunners accidentally shot a hole through the bell when they were trying to shoot down a bomber at the time. And then you've got the remains of Anhalter Bahnhof, which was one of the main railway stations in Berlin at the time. The ruins have been left as a sort of symbol, to not forget the war. It did survive the war in a semi-ruined state and was used up until 1955, but was then demolished in 1955 or 60, 55 or 60. So that's still there, and there's a huge Luftschutz bunker beside it.
What's one of those? Is that just a air raid bunker?
Air raid bunker, yeah. Luftschutz is German for air raid defense. So there's a huge bunker beside the remains of the station, which was used to, shelter passengers in the event of an air raid, that were concentrated in the station. There's actually an underground tunnel running between the bunker and the station. People could evacuate the station into the bunker. It's a huge thing, And it was actually hit a few times by during American air raids. You can still see the bomb damage on the bunker. Bunkers actually has been turned into a museum, World War II museum now.
I was going to say, it's something like that bunker. There's an enormous amount of resources to take these things away immediately after the war. So they sort of got left.
Yeah, that's a case with a lot of the concrete structures that were created as bunkers. Different types of bunkers. The above ground ones were called Hochbunker, which is high bunker basically. And then there were underground bunkers. A lot of the Hochbunkers still exist because they were just too difficult to remove. So you've got Anhalter Bahnhof there. That's right in the centre of Berlin. The most interesting one for me, coming from sort of a military perspective, is the Flak Tower at Humboldtine in the north of the city. It still exists. It was a military building as opposed to the air raid shelters designed for civilians. The Flak Turm was designed as a fortress, basically, to defend Berlin from the bombing. There were 3 pairs of Flak Turms in Berlin, one in the west of the city, Zoo Bahnhof, and then they had a separate radar bunker, which had to be, I think, 800 meters away from the flak bunker, because the vibrations from the flak guns would have interfered with the radars. So they had to be so far away that the vibration didn't do this. So that's why
that's incredible. These towers are massive as well, aren't
huge,
they? So you wouldn't have thought,
absolutely huge.
You wouldn't have thought the vibration would necessarily be a problem. It's maybe amplified its size.
The reason vibration was a problem was because the subsoil of Berlin is sand, okay? These things are basically built on sand, right? Each tower had 4 twin 128 millimeter electronically operated guns. Okay. So you got 8 on each flak tower. And if they're blasting away, then it creates a hell of a lot of vibration. They were electronically guided from the radar towers. All the crews had to do was load the shells. Everything else, the trajectory, range, height, it was all worked out electronically from the radar. So we're quite sophisticated, And the only one that can still be seen today is in the north of the city at Humboldtine. The Zoo bunker, it was completely erased by the Royal Engineers. It was in the British sector. The Humboldtine bunker was in the French sector at the time, and they tried to destroy it. Just one side of it collapsed because it overlooks a major railway junction, and they were worried if they completely destroyed it, it would damage the railway infrastructure, which they needed at the time very badly. So they just decided to leave it and built up the sides of it with rubble from destroyed buildings and landscaped it and put trees. Now, this is like in subsequent years, I don't think they finished doing this until the 1970s. It's an imposing site, especially from the train. If you're going past it, it's just sitting way, way above the railway lines. It looks like they look like medieval castles. That's exactly what they look like, and that's what they were designed to look like as well. Just this massively imposing structure. with towers in each corner with the guns. So that's another surviving structure. And then you've got the Reich Aviation Ministry on Wilhelmstrasse, which was Goering's headquarters, and it ran all the administration for the Luftwaffe. It survived fairly intact, and it's quite an imposing building as well, right in the center of Berlin.
Was that just luck, or because it was built to survive bombing?
No, it was just luck. It wasn't built of heavy concrete and rebar and things like the flak towers, say, or the Luftschutzbunkers. bunkers. No, it was an admin building, but luckily, well, it survived anyway. Pretty intact.
Oh, so they're quite big structures that have survived either through luck or through the fact that they're built to survive, and then nobody could actually destroy them after the war. It's too much of a pain in the bum to get rid of them. But if you walk around Berlin, are there other smaller sites that just go unnoticed or get overlooked that somehow survived the bombing and the fighting?
Yeah, loads, absolutely loads of them. Berlin architecture, strange. Some of the buildings, you look at a building and it looks like something that's typically built maybe in the 1960s, 70s, it's sort of bland sort of style. A lot of them were built in the 20s and into the mid-30s, so you wouldn't necessarily know what you're looking at until you sort of go back and have a look at the history of the place, In Schöneberg, there's a very interesting structure, which it's sort of outside the tourist area where most people will visit Berlin, but it's very interesting. It's what's called a heavy load-bearing body. The German word for it is one of these amazingly long German words. It's called the Schwerbelastungskörper, which translates to heavy load-bearing body. And basically, this is a giant cylinder of solid concrete, okay? It's 60 foot tall, and I think the diameter is about 35 feet, and it weighs over 12,000 tons. What it was built for was, right, you've heard of Germania, Hitler's plan for Germania to build Berlin into this giant sort of ridiculous city, So Berlin's built on sand. So Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, said, whoa, hang on. These structures are going to be huge. What we've got to do is find out whether the soil of Berlin will actually hold these things and they won't sink. So in the southwest of the city, right near where what was going to be built, what they was called the Triumphal Arch. Okay, this is like a sort of Arc de Triomphe, except sort of 4 times the size or something ridiculous like that. So near to the side of that, they built this huge solid cylinder with all these measuring instruments to see over a period of time. Now, don't forget, these guys were convinced they were going to win the war, right? So they said, right, over the next 4 or 5 years, we'll see if this will sink or if it will hold this weight. And if it holds the weight without sinking, then we can build our triumphal arch here. Basically, they built this thing and it didn't sink. Scientists kept monitoring it even after the war to see if this thing actually was going to sink. And it didn't. It didn't sink. And it's still there. And it's fascinating. They've built an observation platform beside it where you can go up onto the observation platform and have a wonderful view over Berlin, because Berlin's very flat. There are very few places where you can actually go and have a look over the city. This is one of the places you can go and look over the city and have a look at this ridiculous 12,000 ton cylinder. You actually go inside it. It's not totally solid. There's doorways, and you can go in around the bottom and you can see where they had the monitoring instruments and all that sort of stuff. And it's fascinating.
Sounds like Speer was trying to avoid building something like the Leaning Tower of Pisa that he built, and then years later it ends up leaning. And I've learnt my lesson from that piece of history. Let's just test the ground first.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a lesser known one. Another one which I love visiting is, and there's another air raid bunker called the Hochbunker Heckeshorn, and it's in Wannsee. a lot of people will make the effort to go to Wannsee to visit the famous conference house, the Wannsee conference. Yeah, where
That's where they discuss the Holocaust.
yeah.
The final solution.
Yeah, hosted by Reinhard Heydrich. Yeah, in 1942. So Wannsee Conference House, fascinating to visit. Brilliant reference library there as well. So well, most people go and visit the conference house and then go back to the station, get the train back into Berlin. But if you go out of the conference house and take a right instead of left towards the station, the road spirals up for like maybe a couple hundred yards and ends at completely intact Luftschutz school. Luftschutz was the air raid defense, right? So they had all these air raid defense wardens and staff and people trained to fight fires and all that sort of stuff. So they built a whole school up there to train these people. And there's a huge bunker up there, a huge air raid bunker designed to shelter them. And also it coordinated all the flak defenses of Berlin, because Wannsee's sort of maybe 7-8 miles outside the center. So that's where they coordinated the air raid defenses, because you don't want to coordinate the air raid defenses from somewhere where the bombs are dropping on your head. So they did it from outside the city in this huge hot bunker. And the whole school complex is still there. The bunker still has a camouflage paint on the outside of it. It's actually used by the German Red Cross now. It's not abandoned, although the school complex is abandoned, but the bunker is used by the Red Cross. And it was also used after the war to coordinate the Berlin airlift by the US Air Forces. So they used that hot bunker as well. So it's a very historic place, but not very many people know it's there. Another hawk bunker. I keep dwelling back on these hawk bunkers.
Well, they survived. They're built for survival, and they have survived.
Yeah, and then they're imposing. There's another one near the center of Berlin, the hawk bunker Palaststrasse. It was built to house people who were attending rallies in what was called the Sportspalast, and the Sportspalast. It's off Potsdamer Strasse in the southwest of the city again. The Sportspalast was where Hitler had a lot of his rallies, and where Goebbels gave the famous total war speech. So they decided, right, that thousands of people are attending these rallies. We've got to have a bunker near at hand. So they built the hawk bunker, Palaststrasse. And again, it wasn't completed by the end of the war. But because it's in a very built up area, then they couldn't blow it up. So what they did was they just left it. And there's a huge complex of apartments that have actually been built over the top of it. So the bunkers there sticking out both sides of this complex of apartments. And so, yeah, it's a very strange thing to come across, because it's this sort of mixture of modern apartments and Nazi bunker built into one thing, It's interesting. Let's see, other things I say. There's a big housing complex in Steglitz called Graserdam, and it was built late 30s into 1940. Again, Nazi designed, imposing, sort of everything sort of quite grand, but built of dark stone, One of the selling points when they were building it was that each apartment had its own bomb shelter, so even 39, 40, even before anybody thought of dropping a bomb on Berlin, they were building air raid shelters because they knew what was coming. And this was a selling point to these apartments. It's interesting because on the outside of the apartments, there's figurines, plaster figures and of German fairy tales like Brothers Grimm and Hansel and Gretel and stuff like that. But above two apartments, one has the figure of a Hitler Youth, and another has a BDM girl. And BDM's was the female version of the Hitler Youth, yeah. Is a band of German maidens. That's what they call the BDM. So these figures are still there. This Hitler Youth kid holding a flag and the BDM girl with her plaited hair. Those are still there above some of the doors,
Just think of those buildings that have survived. I was in London before Christmas, and I was stood somewhere looking at what I presumed was Second World War bomb damage. And then my sister went, "Have you read the plaque?" And it turned out to be First World War bomb damage. And you suddenly think, oh, wow, so that bomb damage it does all survive. So these buildings that have survived, are they damaged? Because I can't remember. I should have looked it up. There's that detective series set in Berlin after the war, and they did an amazing job.
Babylon Berlin.
No, post Second World War, where the women in the police force, because the men have been taken out. Anyway, it's fine. It's not brilliant, but what they do it is incredibly is do these aerial shots of ruined Berlin, and you suddenly think to yourself, that's a lot of there's just roads and ruins. But I just wondered, those buildings that survived. I'm not sure how much Berlin really did survive, but is there damage to them? Can you see where things have been sort of patched, built upon, fixed, left?
Absolutely. What you see from those aerial shots, I know what the famous footage you're talking about. It's color footage taken from an aircraft going over the center of Berlin. That's the central district, right? It got hit, obviously, the worst. Once you sort of go outside that, a lot of buildings survived intact or relatively intact. There was a program after the war where in each district where they sent people around with a camera and a clipboard, and they had a look at each building and said, right, that's intact, that's okay, that's fixable. The structure's there. The roof might be gone, but the walls are still there. So we'll fix that one. Or that one's a write-off. We'll demolish that one. And that's how they did it. And you'll see in Berlin a lot of, and you'll sort of see a row of houses and then just a gap, like a pulled tooth. A lot of time they haven't rebuilt these. They're normally kids' playgrounds now. But you just see a gap in a row of buildings. You'll know that one was destroyed and just pulled down. But as far as damage, yes, you can certainly see on a lot of old buildings evidence of the bombing and the Battle of Berlin. Now, a lot of plaster work, if it's a building that has been plastered, a lot of that will have been completely plastered over and it's invisible. But if it's a brick building, the evidence is there. You can see chips, you can see bullet holes, you can see shrapnel, and particularly on metal structures such as bridge supports and things like that. Iron bridge supports, you'll see lots of marks from shrapnel or from bombs, mortars, all sorts of stuff, because, that's impossible to cover over. Even on the pavements, if you keep your eyes down, because a lot of the pavements in Berlin are pre-war. You'll see splatter marks from Katyusha rockets and where mortar bombs have fallen and shrapnel and all sorts of stuff. There's a bridge, an S-Bahn bridge in Charlottenburg, Liebknestrasse, I think it is, and it's plastered in small arms damage. And there's a hole through one of the bridge supports, and you can actually see the rifling where the armor-piercing round went right through the bridge support. And I went so far as to take a tape measure there one time and measured the diameter of the hole. And it's 85 millimeters. Therefore, the hole was made by a T-34 85 millimeter round or an Su-85 assault gun, which both use the same gun. But you can look right through it and you can just see the rifling. It's amazing.
It's amazing the bridge didn't fall down and they haven't replaced the steelworks. There's a lot about the over-engineering of the bridge that they don't need to fix it.
No, absolutely. You'll see that all over the place in Berlin. Graveyards is a good place to go to see World War II damage. A lot of the old gravestones are just peppered and all sorts of stuff. They don't tend to repair them. A lot of the old graveyards in Berlin are just, they're full up and they just leave them. And they're great places to go to for social history as well. If a neighborhood, if it's got big mausoleums, then, then that's been quite a well-to-do neighborhood. And yeah, you got a lot of war graves in there as well. And most of the graveyards in Berlin will have war graves from, sort of, you can see when the bombing rates started, because most of them, you see a lot of the same date. A lot of people killed on the same date, so that's going to be a during a raid.
Those wartime graves, would they have had Nazi iconography on? At which point, I was going to ask about, denazifying buildings and Berlin, but it suddenly struck me, do some of the graves have Nazi symbols on that have then been removed, or they left those on? Or do they tend not to put them on?
No, they're very simple. World War One war graves are very different. I digress for a second. If World War One German graves will typically have, maybe if the guy's been awarded the Iron Cross, they'll have an Iron Cross, and they'll detail his unit and his rank and date of birth, date of death, and stuff like that. Well, there's not a lot of those in Berlin because obviously a lot of the guys in World War One were buried out on the Western Front, but they must have brought some guys home. But the World War Two graves are just basically a simple square of sort of reddish brown stone laid flat into the ground in the graveyard with the person's name and their date of birth and date of death. And that's all. You won't even be able to tell whether it was a civilian or a soldier. Although there's one I can think of. There's probably other ones, but there's one I can think of in a graveyard in Hermannstrasse that says 10 unknown German soldiers, right? Now, I did a bit of research in that particular graveyard during the Battle of Berlin. There were 10 French SS of the Charlemagne division who were in that graveyard and were hit by a Soviet artillery shell in the graveyard and killed. And you actually still see the damage from where that shell hit in the graveyard. And I would bet my bottom dollar that those 10 in that grave are those 10 French SS, because it's literally yards away from where they were killed. To go back to your question, no, there wouldn't been any Nazi symbolism on the gravestones at all, no.
But Berlin was, to some extent, denazified. Has some of that been missed, or are they fairly comprehensive, removing swastikas and, well, I'm not sure the extent of they removed things. Eagles? I mean, where does it stop and start, the programme?
There's no swastikas that I know of in Berlin, but never say never, some little back street somewhere. But no, denazification seemed to basically stop at the swastika. There's a lot of eagles. You'll be surprised how many Nazi eagles there are on buildings still around Berlin. Particularly, there's one I can think of, and it's a tax office in Charlottenburg, and it has a really spectacular one above the door. The denazification probably stopped at the swastikas. Pretty much everything else has been left intact. Even there was a barracks, a Wehrmacht barracks in Spandau that was used post-war by the British occupation forces. In the guard room, in the entrance to the barracks, it has like an awning with ornamental posts holding up the awning. Awning's not the right word. You know what I mean? A roof. Both these posts have Wehrmacht soldiers carved into them, and also World War One German soldiers, and also soldiers from the Franco-Prussian Wars. Because it was a barracks going back to before the First World War. So there's lots of interesting little things around that you can find that's sort of left over from that era. The Spandau Citadel, which is a fortress going back to like the 17th century. The steel gates have World War II era German helmets on the gates, and it says 1939 above them. So there's all sorts of little things about that you can find.
Did the Soviets do anything different from the Allies on their part of Berlin when it came to memorializing or saving things or knocking things down? Is there a different feel to what was left over from the war from the East and West Berlin?
In the Western Allied occupation zones, that's the French, the Americans and British, yeah? They used a lot of stuff left over because Berlin was so beaten up. They didn't want to knock stuff down that didn't need knocked down. They needed barracks for the occupation troops for a start. So they just took over a lot of the old Wehrmacht barracks and used them. As far as discussed before, earlier on, surviving Nazi structures, they just incorporated them into the infrastructure and the administration of West Berlin. Whereas the Soviets, they were more ideological in their destruction of things, such as the Reich Chancellery. The Reich Chancellery, Hitler's Reich Chancellery, right? It survived pretty much intact, surprisingly. But because it was Hitler's Reich Chancellery, the Soviets leveled it, even though it could have been used for administration.
I assumed it'd be the other way around. I thought the Soviets might be slightly more pragmatic because they were not wanting to throw any money at anything.
They ideologically destroyed Nazi structures such as, as I said, the Reich Chancellery. They leveled Potsdamer Platz, which is a very famous famous square in Berlin. In East Berlin, they built what they called Stalin Alley just after the war, which was a huge stylized Soviet style boulevard stretching sort of from Alexanderplatz way east. So they leveled all the old neighborhoods there around East Berlin and built this wedding cake style sort of boulevard, very much wider than the street that was there previously. And yeah, named it after Stalin, and knocked down a load of the old East Berlin neighborhoods and put up Soviet style, sort of very utilitarian housing, which was necessary, I suppose, at the time because people needed houses and a lot of them were destroyed. So they put these things up. The Soviets also built 3 huge Soviet memorials and war cemeteries in Berlin, whereas obviously the Allies didn't have any war cemeteries in Berlin because the Western Allies didn't fight in Berlin. So there's 3 big ones the Soviets constructed in Berlin. The most famous being by the Tiergarten, which I think has got 2,000 Soviet troops buried in there, and they got 2 T-34 tanks on plinths outside the memorial, plus 252 millimeter artillery pieces there. Once the city was split up, that was in the British zone of occupation. And so everything got a bit contentious, They had Soviet soldiers on these at this memorial because they had ceremonial troops there all the time, right in the middle of the British zone. So things got a bit heated at times. But yeah, the Soviets did things differently for sure, in a more ideological way.
Peter, we're going to pause it there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. You've touched upon this about underground structures surviving. Is there a lot underground surviving? Every now and again, you kind of get someone seems to stumble on a new bunker that gets sort of dug up. Is there a lot of subterranean remnants of the war that are publicly accessible?
Berlin is still a rabbit warren of air raid shelters underneath it. They built hundreds of these things all over the city. The location, a lot of them have been lost to time through paperwork being destroyed and things. So Berlin's constantly being redeveloped. Constantly, it's a city in flux all the time. And the new bunkers are being discovered all the time. There's a group called the Berliner Unterwelten, Berlin Underworlds Association, who exist basically to open these up for public tours. And they do a fantastic job. They do an absolutely amazing job. They're based up at Gesundbrunnen station, which is right opposite the Humboldt-Time Flak Tower discussed earlier on. In Gesundbrunnen station, there's a big air raid shelter underneath, and they've opened that up as a fantastic museum with all the original signage, and there's artifacts down there, and they'll take you down and explain how people lived down there during the air raids. So yeah, they have about 4, I think, air raid shelter tours going in Berlin at the minute. They just opened up a new one earlier on this year, end of last year. From what I've heard, there's 3 more that they're opening up near Tempelhof Airport. To go back to the Flak Tower again, they also run a tour inside the Humboldt-Time Flak Tower, which is absolutely incredible to go on. So yes, to answer your question, there's a lot of stuff still there. There's a lot of underground bunkers which are being opened up.
There must be like time capsules when they stumble upon these things. It must be very peculiar. It literally is as someone left it in 80 years ago, you suddenly find a room that's untouched with whatever was there.
Especially because they'll have all the original signage. Things like Rauchen verboten, no smoking, and Ausgang and Eingang. And an amazing thing is with these area shelters, they use this luminous paint round the doorways and entrances and arrows and stuff. It has survived. The luminosity has not diminished over time. So you shine a torch on one of these luminous arrows, right, and charge it up. Like in the dial on your old watch, you shine a torch on that and then turn the light off. You can see it. Well, you do that, and during the tours they do that. They'll shine the torch on an arrow and then turn all the lights off, and it's just black dark with this big luminous arrow where this thing says "Rauchen verboten" in luminous letters. It's amazing, because it really is. I'd highly recommend taking any of their tours.
Are there many organisations preserving sort of this sort of Second World War history of Berlin? Have they got to the point where they feel, we need to start preserving it rather than hiding it?
Apart from the Berliner Unterwelten, they're the only ones I know of. There's a group, Worston Group, Berlin, Brandenburg, 1945, which is like a research group. They do tours more out sort of east of Berlin, towards the Silo Heights, the battlefields of the Silo Heights. But they do stuff in Berlin as well. But many of the little villages out around Silo, they'll take you out for a tour around there. And there's a lot of stuff out there. The battlefields are there's trench systems and blowing up churches and all sorts of stuff out there. They're trying to keep that sort of history going. And again, as I previously mentioned, the Berliner Unterwelten. As far as German government policy, I don't think they have a definite policy on preserving that sort of history, because it's still sensitive. A lot of Germans don't want to remember that period, or don't even want to talk about it, or don't even want to acknowledge it existed.
Well, is there any war memorials even to sort of German regiments in Berlin? You walk around London and you can't help but fall over war memorials to various wars. I mean, I don't know how much it's memorialised in structures that have survived within Berlin.
There's plenty of World War One war memorials outside a graveyard, maybe a figure of a World War One German soldier complete with helmet and Mauser over his shoulder and stuff like that. World War Two, no. To go back to what we were talking previously, just for a moment, about the Soviets, all those World War One memorials, all that's in West Berlin. Anything militaristic, the Soviets just destroyed. Again, that's another difference between the Soviets' sort of approach to stuff. But to go back to World War II memorials, yes, there are, if you know where to look. As previously mentioned, World War I memorials, which are a lot of, and a lot of them are quite elaborate. But what they'll have done is on the back of the World War I memorial, say the plinth with a soldier on it, if you go around the back, you'll see a little plaque on the back to like the 9th Fallschirmjäger who fought in Berlin, or the Brandenburg Division, or a Panzer Division, 1939, 1945. But they're very discreetly put around the back of the World War I memorials.
So are they added post-war then, or are they added?
They added post-war, yeah. They've been added post-war.
To be fair, that's not vastly different to what a lot of British war memorials are like. They've sort of tacked on to the First World War memorial the names from the Second World War, though there's not necessarily they're the same size lettering usually. It's the same sort of sacrifice.
The German ones are sort of, I think they're under the radar. These maybe a plaque to say the 9th Fallschirmjäger or whatever has probably been paid for by the veterans of that unit. And they have asked the Berlin Senate, they go, can we put this on? And they go, yeah, but you got to put it round the back at the bottom. In the Friedhof Steglitz in southwest Berlin, the cemetery there's a memorial to black units. But I think in order to be allowed to have that memorial, They also had to put 1914, 1918 on it, as well as 1939 and 1945. But there were no German flak units in Berlin 1914, 1918 because it wasn't bombed. So I think in order to get permission to even put the thing up, they had to include the First World War, even though the flak units didn't exist. So there's all sorts of like ways that they're trying to get these things up. I can't see there ever being any more. It'd be veterans themselves, I think, would have done it. Yeah, in answer to your question, they are there, but they're very discreet about it.
Subtle and hidden away. Now, what I'm intrigued by is, well, we were talking before about, I'd been to France with my father in the 80s and visited Normandy, and I felt it was surprisingly underdeveloped. But I'm not sure how popular sort of tours of Berlin are. Are these looking at the Second World War? Are these a more modern, post-millennium, post-fall of the wall sort of development?
Yeah, I think so. I guess
before the fall of the wall, it's politicized. It becomes a bit more of a problem visiting Berlin and seeing it, being able to get everywhere. But I guess post fall of the wall, it opens things up.
Post fall of the wall, probably post millennium. War tourism in Berlin's it's a very different thing to say Normandy, right? Go to Normandy. You go to Normandy maybe for a week and immerse yourself in the whole experience. You've got all the museums and the bunkers and the trenches and, the Mulberry Harbour and stuff like that. Whereas people don't go to Berlin unless you're somebody like me. Don't go to Berlin or war tourism. You maybe go like for a city break or whatever and take a World War II tour as part of your city break, as just like for an afternoon or whatever. Before the millennium, the tours would have been mainly for veterans groups. Allied veterans, obviously, the Western Allies didn't fight in Berlin. So the veterans groups would have been veterans of the occupation forces. Even guys who were there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they'd go back as like a unit reunion, go back to Berlin, visit the old haunts. And those guys had a nice time in Berlin. From what guys have been speaking to and accounts I've read, the Americans, British, and the French had a ball in Berlin after the war. Whereas Soviet veterans groups who visit had sort of slightly different experience because they might have been veterans of combat in Berlin and seen, their comrades killed. A lot of the Soviet veterans would visit round about the first week in May for the anniversary of the German surrender. So they would visit with their families and visit the Soviet war cemeteries once a year and do a tour of their former battlefield, or the families anyway. Of course, in the current political climate, then that isn't going to happen anymore. I mean, we've got the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Berlin coming up in May. There's not going to be any Russians there. Strangely, this year, the Germans are marking it as a public holiday in Germany this year, the 80th anniversary on the 8th of May, which is when the Germans signed the surrender declaration in Berlin, although it was actually signed in France on the 7th in Reims. But the Russians didn't like that idea. They wanted it signed in Berlin. So they had to do it again in Berlin on the 8th of May, even though it had already been done on the 7th. Yeah, I think it's a post-millennium thing. There's not too many people in Berlin do specialist World War II tours. It'll be more a general thing, there's the big sites that we've mentioned before,
How did you get involved? Because you do guiding around the city, don't you?
But I'm quite a late comer to Berlin. The first time I visited Berlin was 2012. And it came from the Anthony Beaver book, actually, his book on Berlin. And I remember seeing a documentary on TV before I'd ever been to Berlin. And he was visiting Berlin doing research for the book. And he was actually with one of the guys from the Berliner Unterwelten. And they were in a courtyard. And the guy was saying, yeah, this is some of the last evidence of the Battle of Berlin here in this courtyard. It was plastered in bullet holes. And I thought to myself, well, that's pretty sad. If I ever visit Berlin, there's not going to be anything left from World War II. And a few years later, I did visit Berlin and started seeing all this damage. And I thought, what were they talking about? You know? So I started photographing all this stuff, because it's disappearing. It is going, over years, it's just disappearing. And I thought, right, okay, gonna do this, start photographing it. So what am I gonna do with these photographs? So I just started up the Facebook page of the Berlin Battle Damage Facebook page, and it developed, it really took off. And then I thought, right, I know what I'll do now. So I advertised on the page that says, is anybody interested in doing a walking tour? I might take a group out. And they got a massive response. And this was before COVID, right? And just before COVID. And then, of course, that happened and everything was knocked on the head. So after COVID, then I put another thing on the page, right, I'm going to start doing this. I just ran one tour as an experiment to see how it went. Again, the focus, I wanted to do sort of more in-depth specialist tours rather than your general, here's the Fuhrer bunker, all that sort of stuff. So I thought, right, I'm going to do a tour on the Red Army's progress through Schöneberg as far as the Tiergarten. So I did that as the first tour, and then I started putting other tours together. I'm basically, I haven't finished. It's an ongoing project. Berlin was split into defense sectors for the Battle of Berlin. Okay, the Germans split it into different defense sectors, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then like a cake. And the central sector, Z, Zitadelle. So I want to do a different tour for each German defense sector eventually. I've got 4 now at the minute, so I still have quite a lot of work to do. And I want to do something special for the 80th anniversary as well. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do yet, but I want to do a few special tours during that week anyway. So yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing project.
What's interesting about things disappearing, often things don't necessarily physically disappear, but they disappear from the cultural memory. So somebody doesn't know what something is because all memory of what that has gone. So people going around shining a light on things to point out, no, that is actually a remnant of, brings it back to life and gives it a relevance that had been lost because nobody knew what it was. It was just a thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's amazing how, 8 years after the war, so many of these things are disappearing because we've just forgotten them. They're still there, that we've just forgotten them. Forgotten what they are, forgotten what they were for, forgotten what they do. It's quite remarkable how quickly it's just sort of disappeared.
Yeah, and especially in Berlin and in Germany as a whole, really, things are purposely forgotten because they want to forget it. Oh, strangely, a lot of the people that go on my tours anyway are Berliners rather than tourists. Not necessarily Germans. I do have Germans, but Berlin residents who want to learn more about the history of their city. It's not advertised as such. The history of Berlin and from that period has been sort of repressed quite a lot, and you got to dig to find it architecturally and historically. As you say, the architecture's been forgotten, and the history is going as well. But people are interested.
But it's like looking at when you see those big chunks missing out of buildings. The chunks, it's bad building work until someone points out, no, that's where a bullet has shot a bit of the stonework out. You suddenly, so walking around St. Paul's in London, there's markings from the Blitz, but it's an old building. Surely they have these things. No, that's from the Blitz. And suddenly once you see them, you start to see them everywhere. The relevance starts popping up, but you have to start to see them before you can start to see them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I found that in Berlin. The first time I went there, I noticed some bomb damage, and then you just start seeing it everywhere. But you got to get your eyes tuned into it. I'd love to take a ballistics expert around Berlin, because sometimes it's easy to tell, especially on, as I mentioned before, on metalwork, what it is. But it's hard to tell a lot of the time whether a certain damage is small arms. Is it from an aerial bomb? Is it from an artillery shell? And, it big chunks out, and so I'd love to take a ballistics expert around and say, yeah, that's from that. And the trajectory came in and all this sort of stuff, that would be fascinating. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. What size bullet do you need to make a big chunk in the wall out of that? which then you can map the fighting almost. Well, they wouldn't have had that, so it's not them, it's this.
Absolutely, yeah. I had a guy on one of my tours who was ex Royal Artillery, and he was very useful. He was able to say, right, yeah, that's from an artillery round, or that's from a bomb, or whatever, you know. Especially the damage to the buildings, you know, and that can't be covered over. It gets a real sense of history from that, knowing what caused it, you know, and when it was caused. Yeah.
Fascinating. The city itself is a historical record if you know where to look. Well, thank you, Peter. Loyal listener, if you'd like to learn more about Berlin's wartime history, you can follow Peter's excellent Facebook page, Berlin Battle Damage, where he shares incredible insights and photos of the city's scars from the past. And if you find yourself in Berlin, why not join one of his walking tours to see it all firsthand? I'll put a link on the website and in the show notes. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget you can support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. By becoming a patron, you'll gain access to ad-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in every discussion. Plus, you'll unlock occasional, exclusive, bonus material that didn't make it into the main podcast. So to sign up, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is it for this episode. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.